The metal tube weighs 13 pounds. Simple, almost crude. No optical sights, no complex mechanisms, just steel and a trigger assembly that a conscript could learn to operate in 20 minutes. The German panzer commander lifts it, turns it over in his hands, and for a moment his face shows nothing. But inside a calculation is collapsing. 4 years of doctrine. 4 years of believing that armor supremacy was destiny, that the panzer was the king of the battlefield, untouchable by common infantry. 4 years of comfortable certainty about to evaporate in the weight of 13 pounds of American pragmatism. In 60 seconds, he would have to write a report that felt like admitting Germany had been solving the wrong problem, while America had been ending the conversation entirely. This is the story of how German forces captured American bazooka tubes in North Africa, Italy, and France, studied them with the precision their engineering tradition demanded, and discovered something more unsettling than a new weapon. This is about the moment an entire philosophy of warfare encountered a different philosophy, and what it revealed about the difference between elegance and effectiveness, between what impresses engineers and what kills tanks, between building weapons for parades and building weapons for privates. What they found in those tubes was not just shape-charge technology. It was a mirror reflecting every assumption the Wehrmacht had made about how mechanized warfare should work. Who should wield the power to stop tanks, and what happens when you give a 19-year-old from Kansas the ability to destroy 80 tons of German steel from 100 meters away? To understand what happened when German technical officers disassembled their first captured bazooka, you need to understand what they believed about anti-tank warfare. They believed it was a specialized discipline requiring specialized troops with specialized training and specialized equipment. The PK-40 anti-tank gun, the weapon Germany built its anti-armor doctrine around, weighed 200 pounds. It required a crew of 5 to 8 men. It needed a vehicle to move it. Deploying it meant selecting positions, digging it in, camouflaging it, creating fields of fire. It was effective, certainly. German gunners became legendary for their skill, but effectiveness came with enormous logistical weight. The PK-40 couldn't follow infantry into cities, couldn't be carried up mountains, couldn't be quickly repositioned when the tactical situation shifted. It represented a philosophy. Anti-tank warfare belonged to specialists, positioned deliberately, fighting from prepared positions. Infantry, regular line infantry, were not expected to threaten armor. They were expected to survive it, take cover from it, wait for their own armor or anti-tank units to deal with it. The arrival of the panzer on a battlefield where you had no anti-tank support meant withdrawal, defensive positions, desperation. This was not unique to Germany. This was conventional wisdom in 1942. Tanks were killed by other tanks, by anti-tank guns, by carefully positioned defenses. The infantryman, the basic rifleman, the ordinary soldier, was not part of that equation. Then American infantrymen started killing panzers with tubes they carried on their shoulders. The first bazookas appeared in North Africa in late 1942. German after-action reports from Tunisia mentioned them with a tone of irritation more than alarm. American infantry weapon shoulder-fired some kind of rocket, limited effectiveness noted against frontal armor. Early encounters suggested it was more psychological than tactical, that crews were bailing out of tanks that had not actually been penetrated, that the weapon was crude and unreliable. This assessment was not entirely wrong. The early M1 bazooka had significant limitations. Its 60mm warhead struggled against heavier armor. Electrical firing systems were vulnerable to moisture. Effective range was short, maybe 100 to 150 meters under ideal conditions. German intelligence officers filed reports noting the weapon existed, recommending continued observation, not immediate alarm. But something was happening at the infantry level that the reports were not quite capturing. American rifle companies were not using the bazooka the way German doctrine said anti-tank weapons should be used. They were not positioning them carefully in prepared defenses. They were moving with them, aggressively, taking them into urban environments, into forests, into exactly the complex terrain where the PAK-40 could not go. A two-man team, a gunner and a loader, could set up in seconds, fire and displace before German tanks could respond. They were hunting armor. This was not supposed to be possible. The bazooka was not changing the battlefield through technical superiority. It was changing the battlefield through philosophical disruption. It was giving the most numerous soldiers on the battlefield, ordinary infantrymen, the ability to threaten the most valuable assets, main battle tanks. Every rifle squad suddenly carried the potential to become an anti-tank team. The mathematics of armored warfare were shifting in ways that could not be countered by building better tanks. By 1943, as American forces pushed into Sicily and then mainland Italy, German units were capturing bazookas regularly, not just the tubes but ammunition, training manuals, after-action observations from interrogated prisoners. The picture coming into focus was deeply uncomfortable. Technical analysis confirmed what battlefield reports suggested. The M1A1 bazooka, the improved version appearing in Italy, used a shaped charge warhead based on the Monroe effect, the same physics behind German Panzerfaust development. The charge created a focused jet of superheated metal capable of penetrating 3 to 4 inches of armor plate. More importantly, it did this regardless of the angle of attack, within reason. Sloped armor, the innovation German designers were so proud of, offered less protection against shaped charges than against conventional anti-tank rounds. The weapon weighed 13 pounds empty, 15 pounds loaded. A soldier could carry it all day. 6 rounds of ammunition weighed about 20 pounds total, manageable for a loader. Training time was minimal. American field manuals suggested a soldier could achieve basic proficiency in a few hours, combat effectiveness in a few days. The Americans were not trying to make their infantry into anti-tank specialists. They were making anti-tank capability so simple that every infantryman could threaten armor. This was the philosophical divergence. Germany was creating specialized excellence. America was creating distributed capability. Germany was building weapons that required expertise. America was building weapons that assumed the user was a farm kid from Iowa who had never seen a tank before last month and needed to kill one tomorrow. The Italian campaign provided brutal field data, narrow roads, mountainous terrain, urban combat zones where German armor should have dominated, where the weight and firepower of panzers should have made them invincible against infantry. Instead, American rifle companies were systematically stalling German armored advances using bazookas employed from buildings, from tree lines, from rocks and rubble that anti-tank guns could never have reached. The tank commanders were not incompetent. They were facing a tactical problem that their doctrine had not prepared them for. In open terrain, you could see anti-tank guns, identify their positions, suppress them with fire or maneuver around them. A bazooka team in an Italian hill town could be anywhere, 2 men in any window or doorway, invisible until the moment they fired. By the time you identified the position, they had displaced. The next street, the next building, another team or the same team in a new location. How do you assault a city where every window might hide the weapon that ends your tank? The answer increasingly was that you did not. You called for infantry support, for artillery, for engineers. You slowed down. The bazooka was not outperforming German armor in open battle. It was denying German armor the ability to operate freely in the complex terrain where modern war was increasingly being fought. It was a weapon optimized not for destroying every tank, but for making tank commanders afraid, for changing their behavior, for forcing them to slow down, button up, lose situational awareness, become vulnerable to all the other ways infantry could kill armor. When German technical intelligence brought captured bazookas back to testing facilities in Germany for systematic evaluation, the analysis became more troubling with each measurement. The weapon was almost insultingly simple. The tube was seamless steel, electrically welded. No precision machining, no complex components, nothing that required specialized manufacturing capability. The sights were basic, a simple folding wireframe crude by the standards of German optics, but adequate for the ranges at which the weapon was employed. The rocket motor was basic too. Solid propellant, simple ignition system, no guidance, no sophistication. It was a weapon designed to be manufactured by the thousands in factories that did not need specialized equipment or highly trained workers. This was the part that German engineers, raised in a tradition that valued precision and craftsmanship, struggled with. The bazooka was not elegant. It was not a triumph of engineering ingenuity. It was barely more sophisticated than a tube with a trigger, and it worked. It worked at scale. American production numbers, when German intelligence pieced them together, were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of bazookas, millions of rounds. Enough that every American rifle company could have multiple teams, enough that losses in combat were irrelevant. Enough that soldiers could train with live ammunition, because ammunition was not a precious resource to be conserved. Germany could not match this production, not because German factories were incapable of building bazookas, but because German factories were building Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks and a dozen other weapons, and none of them were being produced in the quantities that would fundamentally alter infantry capabilities across the entire army. The realization settling over German tactical analysts was not that America had built a better weapon. It was that America had built a different kind of military. The bazooka was part of a system. It existed alongside the M4 Sherman, another weapon German officers initially dismissed as inferior to German armor. The Sherman was not as heavily armored as a Tiger, not as powerfully armed as a Panther, but America was building them faster than Germany could destroy them. And every Sherman crew knew that if they got into trouble, American infantry with bazookas would be nearby, changing the tactical equation. The bazooka existed alongside American logistics, the unglamorous capacity to keep units supplied with ammunition, to replace losses, to maintain equipment in the field. A weapon is only as effective as your ability to keep it supplied and in action. Germany was fighting a war where every Panzerfaust was precious, where anti-tank ammunition had to be conserved, where losses were difficult to replace. America was fighting a war where a rifle company could burn through a dozen bazooka rounds in an engagement and receive resupply the same day. The bazooka existed alongside American combined arms doctrine that assumed infantry, armor, artillery, and air power would operate together seamlessly. German doctrine emphasized this too, but American implementation was more flexible, more responsive, more willing to let junior officers and NCOs make tactical decisions. A sergeant with a bazooka team did not need to wait for orders from battalion. He saw a panzer, he killed it, he moved on. This decentralization of lethality, this trust in ordinary soldiers to employ devastating firepower independently, was philosophically alien to armies built on rigid hierarchies and specialized roles. There is a moment in warfare, rare but profound, when you realize you have been optimizing for the wrong variable. The German approach to anti-tank warfare had optimized for effectiveness per weapon, for the killing power of each individual system. The PK-40 could destroy any Allied tank at range. The 88 was legendary. German anti-tank doctrine produced superb weapons operated by superbly trained specialists, but America had optimized for something different: lethality per infantry unit, the total anti-tank capability distributed across the entire army. A German infantry battalion with no attached anti-tank platoon was helpless against armor. An American infantry battalion, even without dedicated anti-tank support, had organic capability to threaten tanks in every rifle company, every platoon potentially carrying multiple bazooka teams. The total anti-armor capability of the American army was not concentrated in specialized units. It was diffused through the entire force. This meant that every German armored advance, every panzer movement, faced potential anti-tank resistance everywhere. There were no safe areas, no rear zones where armor could operate without infantry support, no respite from the possibility that the next cluster of trees or ruined building contained soldiers with the means to kill you. The psychological weight of this was immense. Tank commanders became cautious, conservative, reluctant to push forward without extensive support. Armor lost its flexibility, its capacity for rapid maneuver, its ability to exploit breakthroughs. The breakthrough that defined German success in 1940 was becoming impossible by 1944, not because Allied armor was superior, but because Allied infantry had become lethal to armor in a way that fundamentally altered the risk calculation of armored warfare. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, German defenders were facing improved bazooka variants alongside a new threat, the M9 bazooka with a 36-inch warhead that could penetrate up to 7 inches of armor. German tankers reported encounters where American infantry would allow panzers to advance into ambush zones before engaging from multiple directions at close range. The tactic was simple and devastating. Let the armor penetrate into terrain where their advantages, speed and standoff range, were neutralized. Then hit them from the sides and rear, where shaped charges could penetrate any armor Germany fielded. A platoon of infantry with 3 or 4 bazooka teams could stop a company of panzers if the terrain was right, if they were disciplined, if they were willing to let the tanks come close enough to guarantee kills. This required extraordinary courage. Shaped charge or not, facing a panzer at 100 meters was facing your own annihilation if you missed or if the infantry supporting the armor spotted you first. But American infantry were doing it. Repeatedly, successfully. The hedgerows of Normandy, terrain that should have been a nightmare for the attackers, became a nightmare for German armor because every hedgerow could conceal a bazooka team, because the close-quarters combat negated German range advantages, because American infantry had been trained to hunt tanks and given the weapons to do it. German after-action reports from Normandy read differently than those from earlier campaigns. Less confidence, more requests for infantry support before committing armor, more discussion of vulnerability, of needing to secure flanks, of the necessity of combined arms even for simple movements. The panzer was still a formidable weapon, but it was no longer the king of the battlefield. It had become a valuable asset that required protection, support, careful employment. The Americans had done this with a 13-pound tube. The deeper you dig into the German analysis of the bazooka, the more you find them wrestling with implications they did not want to confront. Some reports are coldly technical, discussing penetration values and effective ranges, recommending countermeasures like standoff armor and tactical adjustments. But other reports, especially those from officers with extensive combat experience, reveal something more unsettling. They were recognizing that the bazooka represented a philosophy of warfare that Germany was losing to. The German military tradition valued expertise, specialization, the cultivation of elite units and advanced technology. This had produced extraordinary tactical successes. German tank aces, fighter pilots, U-boat commanders. These were soldiers whose individual skill and superior equipment made them legends. But warfare at scale, industrial warfare, total war, was not about creating legends. It was about creating systems. It was about distributing capability so widely that individual excellence became less important than collective capacity. The bazooka was the perfect symbol of this. It did not require an expert. It required a willing soldier and 20 minutes of instruction. It did not require perfect conditions. It worked in mud, in cities, in forests, in all the places where war actually happened. It did not require rare materials or precision manufacturing. It required steel and explosives, resources America had in functionally infinite supply. Germany could build better anti-tank weapons. Germany did build better anti-tank weapons. The Panzerschreck, developed partly in response to captured bazookas, had longer range and a more powerful warhead. But Germany could not build them in the quantities that mattered, could not distribute them widely enough to change the fundamental tactical picture, could not escape the reality that they were trying to win an industrial war with artisanal methods. There is a particular kind of cognitive dissonance that comes from being very good at something and then discovering that being very good does not matter as much as you thought. German panzer crews were, man for man, probably the best tank soldiers in the world by 1944, better trained, more experienced, fighting in technologically superior vehicles when those vehicles were available. But they were being killed by American farm boys with weapons simple enough to manufacture in Bridgeport and Akron, used by soldiers whose primary qualification was a willingness to carry the tube and the courage to get close enough to use it. The shape of the war was being determined not by excellence, but by scale, not by the quality of individual systems, but by the quantity and distribution of adequate systems. This was the lesson the German military was learning, painfully, across every domain. Their fighters were better, but they faced endless waves of Allied aircraft. Their U-boats were sophisticated, but they faced industrial ship production that replaced losses faster than they could sink them. Their tanks were formidable, but they faced combined arms teams where every element, infantry, armor, artillery, air support, was adequate and available in overwhelming numbers. The bazooka was just one small part of this picture, but it was the part that German infantry faced directly, the part that turned every American rifle squad into a potential tank killer, the part that made defensive positions infinitely more dangerous because you could not simply blast through with armor anymore. You had to clear every position, suppress every possible firing point, advance with paranoid caution through exactly the kind of slow, grinding combat that negated German tactical advantages. After the war, German officers writing about their experiences returned again and again to the theme of being overwhelmed, not by superior tactics or superior courage, but by superior resources and a willingness to employ adequate solutions at massive scale. The bazooka comes up frequently in these accounts, not as the weapon that defeated Germany, but as the weapon that symbolized what defeated Germany: the willingness to give ordinary soldiers extraordinary capability, the acceptance that simple and reliable beats elegant and complicated when you need to arm millions of men, the understanding that distributed lethality, even if individually less impressive than concentrated excellence, changes the mathematics of warfare in ways that concentrated excellence cannot counter. There is a remarkable document in the U.S. Army archives, a detailed German technical evaluation of captured American infantry weapons conducted in late 1944. The section on the bazooka is clinically precise, measuring every aspect of performance, comparing it to German equivalents, noting its limitations. The conclusion is almost begrudging in its respect. The weapon is crude, the report says, but effective for its purpose. Its simplicity allows for mass production and minimal training requirements. Its lightweight design allows organic anti-tank capability at the rifle company level, altering tactical possibilities for infantry operations. Recommendation: German forces should assume all American infantry units possess organic anti-tank capability and plan accordingly. What that last line means, stripped of military formality, is this: we can no longer assume our armor is safe anywhere. We can no longer maneuver with the freedom that armored warfare requires. We have to fight as if every enemy position can kill our tanks, because now every position can. But there is another layer here, one that the technical reports could not quite articulate. The bazooka worked because America was willing to trust its soldiers. That sounds like propaganda, but follow the logic. Giving every rifle company organic anti-tank capability meant giving young soldiers, not specialists, not carefully selected anti-tank experts, but regular infantrymen, the power to destroy expensive armored vehicles with a single shot. It meant accepting that some of those soldiers would make mistakes, waste ammunition, fire at inappropriate targets. It meant decentralizing tactical decisions about when and how to engage armor to the lowest levels of the command structure. German doctrine emphasized control, coordination, adherence to plan. American doctrine, at least as it evolved during the war, emphasized initiative, flexibility, empowerment of junior leaders. The bazooka was not just a weapon, it was a vote of confidence in the soldier carrying it. It said, "You are smart enough to know when to fire this. You are trusted to make life and death decisions about engaging enemy armor. You do not need an officer looking over your shoulder. You do not need specialized training beyond the basics. You are enough." That philosophy, multiplied across millions of soldiers, created an army that was tactically flexible in ways that hierarchical, specialist-focused armies struggled to match. When the situation changed, American infantry could adapt because they had the tools and the authority to make decisions. When doctrine failed, which it always does eventually in combat, soldiers could improvise because they had capability distributed throughout the force rather than concentrated in specialist units that might not be available when needed. The German response to the bazooka, to the extent there was a coordinated response, focused on technical countermeasures, adding skirt armor to tanks to defeat shaped charges, training tank commanders to avoid terrain where bazookas could be employed effectively, increasing infantry support for armored operations. These were all reasonable tactical adjustments, but they missed the deeper problem. The deeper problem was not the bazooka specifically. It was that America had built a military system optimized for a kind of war Germany was not prepared to fight. A war where victory went not to the side with the best technology or the most skilled soldiers, but to the side that could put adequate capability in the hands of enough people to be everywhere at once, to threaten the enemy constantly, to grind down excellence through sheer persistent presence. Germany could train better tank commanders, but they could not train them faster than America could build bazookas. Germany could build better tanks, but they could not build them in numbers that mattered when every street and tree line might hide an American private with a shaped charge. Germany could develop better tactics, but tactics assumed you had resources to execute them, time to maneuver, space to operate. The bazooka and weapons like it were denying Germany all three. Every advance took longer, cost more, required more support, because the threat was everywhere and anywhere. The initiative was bleeding away not through decisive defeat, but through accumulated friction, through the thousand small ways that distributed anti-tank capability, made armored warfare slower, more dangerous, less decisive. By 1945, as Germany collapsed, the bazooka had become so routine in American infantry operations that it barely rated mention in after-action reports. It was just assumed that rifle companies would have them, would use them, would employ them effectively, without special coordination or planning. This normalization was the ultimate vindication of the design philosophy. The weapon had become invisible through ubiquity, so thoroughly integrated into American infantry doctrine that it was simply part of what infantry did. German prisoners interrogated in the final months of the war spoke about American infantry, with a respect that had not been present in earlier periods. Not because American soldiers had become individually more formidable, though experience had certainly improved their effectiveness, but because American infantry units were comprehensively lethal in ways that German infantry was not. They had more automatic weapons, more radios, more artillery support, better logistics and, yes, organic anti-tank capability that made them dangerous to armor without requiring specialized support. The German infantryman, often superb in skill and determination, was being asked to do more with less, while his opponent was being given every tool that industrial production could provide. The asymmetry was crushing, not in any single battle but across thousands of battles, across the cumulative weight of fighting an enemy who could replace losses, resupply constantly, and equip every unit with weapons that matched German specialists. Here is what the bazooka story reveals about war, technology, and human systems. Elegance loses to adequacy at scale. Excellence loses to distribution. The perfect weapon that only specialists can use loses to the good enough weapon that everyone can carry. This is not intuitive. Our instinct is to admire the best, to invest in quality, to believe that superior technology and superior training will triumph. And in small-scale engagements, in isolated battles, they often do. But modern war, industrial war, total war, is not small-scale. It is the accumulated effect of a million small decisions, a million tactical engagements, a million moments where having adequate capability immediately available matters more than having perfect capability somewhere else. The German military in World War II was in many ways the finest fighting force ever assembled when judged by traditional metrics. Unit for unit, soldier for soldier, weapon for weapon, they were often superior, but they were fighting a war where those traditional metrics were becoming less relevant than capacity, resilience, and scale. The bazooka did not win the war. No single weapon wins wars. But it represented the philosophy that did win, the willingness to make soldiers powerful rather than making specialized units elite, the acceptance that simple and reliable beats complex and perfect, the understanding that the enemy everywhere is more dangerous than the perfect weapon somewhere. The men who carried bazookas into combat, the American privates and corporals who humped those tubes through France and Germany, were mostly not aware of any of this. They knew the weapon worked. They knew it gave them a chance against tanks that would otherwise have been untouchable. They knew it was heavy, awkward, required courage to use effectively because you had to get close, and absolutely satisfying when you saw a panzer brewing up after your shot connected. They did not think of themselves as embodying a philosophy of warfare or representing industrial democracy's triumph over specialized authoritarianism. They were trying to survive, to complete their mission, to get home. But their collective actions, The thousands of engagements where American infantry with bazookas stopped German armor, changed the tactical calculus of the war in ways that no amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome. They made armor cautious, they slowed German maneuver, they created space for American combined arms to function. They bought time for artillery, for air power, for friendly armor to arrive. They did all of this with a weapon that German engineers, examining it for the first time, initially dismissed as crude. Crude it may have been, but crude and everywhere beats refined and scarce. That is the lesson German technical intelligence learned from those captured tubes. That is what made those reports uncomfortable reading for officers who had spent their careers believing that German engineering excellence and tactical sophistication would be enough. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough, because America was not trying to outbuild Germany 1-for-1. America was trying to make every infantryman a threat to German armor, and with the bazooka, they succeeded. The final irony, and perhaps the final lesson, is that Germany tried to copy the concept. The Panzerschreck was literally called the Raketenpanzerbüchse, the rocket anti-tank rifle, but soldiers called it the Panzerschreck, the tank terror, or sometimes Offenrohr, the stovepipe, a direct acknowledgement of its resemblance to the American bazooka. It was a good weapon, better in some respects than the bazooka, with a larger 88mm warhead and longer effective range. German engineers had taken the American concept and refined it, improved it, made it more German. But they could not make enough of them. They could not distribute them widely enough. They could not overcome the fundamental resource constraints that meant German infantry never had the depth of firepower, the redundancy of capability, the logistical support that made American infantry so comprehensively dangerous. The Panzerschreck was better. The bazooka was everywhere. In that difference lies the outcome of the war. Not determined by it, but reflected in it, the same pattern visible in every domain. German excellence versus Allied adequacy at overwhelming scale. And scale won. Scale always wins, eventually, when the gap in quality is not insurmountable and the gap in quantity is enormous. This is not to diminish German soldiers or German engineering. They were fighting with skill and courage under increasingly impossible conditions. But they were fighting a war their system was not designed to win, a war where individual and unit-level superiority could not compensate for systematic and industrial-level inferiority. The bazooka was just one small part of that story, but it was the part that German panzer commanders saw up close, the part that made every advance nerve-wracking, the part that turned infantry from victims of armor into hunters of armor. 13 pounds of steel tube that changed the war by changing who could fight tanks and how many of them could do it at once. When you hold a bazooka today, in a museum or a military collection, the first thing you notice is how simple it is. No moving parts beyond the trigger mechanism. No optics, no sophistication. Just a tube, a wire sight, and the absolute confidence that this will punch through armor if you can get close enough to use it. The second thing you notice is how light it is. 13 pounds, you could carry this all day. A rifleman could carry this and still fight as a rifleman. The weapon did not require you to become a specialist. It allowed you to remain a general infantry soldier who also happened to be able to kill tanks. That was the revolution. Not in the technology, which was interesting but not unprecedented. Not in the tactics, which were obvious once the weapon existed, but in the philosophy. In the decision to empower millions of ordinary soldiers rather than creating thousands of specialized anti-tank troops. In the acceptance that warfare at scale required distribution of capability, not concentration of excellence. In the willingness to trust young men with devastating power and the judgment to employ it effectively. The Germans examined those captured tubes with the thoroughness their engineering tradition demanded. They measured, tested, analyzed, reported. They understood the technology completely. What they could not quite grasp, or could not quite accept, was that the technology was not the point. The point was the system that produced it, distributed it, supported it, and trusted soldiers to use it. The point was a way of thinking about war that Germany had not adopted, and could not adopt without ceasing to be what it was. And so the reports went up the chain, noted, filed, acted upon where possible, but ultimately unable to change the fundamental trajectory of a conflict where Germany was being buried under the weight of Allied industrial production and tactical flexibility. The bazooka did not bury them alone, but it was part of the avalanche, one of 1,000 adequate weapons produced in overwhelming numbers, wielded by soldiers who were trusted to make decisions, supported by logistics that kept them supplied, integrated into a system that worked not through brilliance but through relentless, grinding, distributed effectiveness. And in the end, that was more than enough.